Good day to you. This is Saturday, the second to the last day of August in 2025 from Chico, and you see we have a slightly different format today. I am forced to use my phone, so this will be a very brief video. And since it will be brief, this would be a good time to interject a hot topic. We are in a Hot Topics in Science series, and of course you can extend that list to hundreds or even thousands of cutting edges of science or something that you personally don't know that you sure would like to know if you only knew you could know it. Well, science is vast. It's one of the attractions of science is we like stories that go on. We want we want it to continue. We don't want the game to end. Nobody likes the game to end. Now, we do have a game going on here on Earth called life, the human life, quite a game. And today I would just like to briefly cover, that is, outline my preferred approach to science as an outline approach for the conveyance of truth, that is, the transmission of information, really just plain old ordinary human communication. What do we like to communicate? Things that might make us happier. That's what we like to communicate as men. Now, we're just grown-up boys, and of course we like to have fun. That's part of the emotional side of life. But emotional life can be a bit daunting, a bit confusing. A rational approach to life is something that needs to be cultivated. It comes online for a human later than the emotional system because the emotional system is needed right away. But the logical system has some prerequisites. You do need to learn language of some kind if you're going to communicate. Science is a process of acquisition of knowledge, which is then transformed into understanding, which can be done because the universe has structure. So this is the key to science. What we'd like to introduce today is a topic that comes up in philosophy, but is not limited to philosophy outside of science. There are two brands of philosophy, one of which is well known to science. We are forced to philosophize. It's also sometimes called theorization. Those kind of overlap. But we are now in this age, in the 21st century, dealing with philosophical issues which have occurred in the past. This is not like anything new, but there are new aspects to old questions. One of the hottest topics in all of philosophy and science is consciousness. Consciousness is a famous, I guess you'd say, hearthside, or get down to the old explorers club or your science club and just get some nice tea or some beverages. Just the boys get together and start talking about life, philosophy, the universe, destiny, fate. You know, what are we doing here? Philosophizing, examining the aspects of life that we all need to face at some time, in some way, somehow, unless we choose to just ignore it, which is part of, I suppose, free will. Now, what we like to do at this Explorers Club is explore the universe, but the universe has many edges, and one of them is a reflection process. This is a term from computer science. Reflection refers to examining the structure of your code, for instance. It's an introspection. Now, in the case of consciousness, that's about as introspective as you can get. Because how would you define consciousness? All right, we're just going to hold that thread and introduce another thread and merge them. The other topic that comes up that's related to consciousness is reality. And that's almost funny. I know you might start giggling. I'm tempted to giggle myself. But in science, we like to suppress that kind of reaction and treat things rationally, and if something doesn't seem appropriate, simply say so logically as if you were a Vulcan. But reality is on the table. Reality is a legitimate... Science really isn't afraid of anything. We'll analyze anything. We'll analyze your religion and tear it to shreds. If we think that that's what we need to do, you're practicing superstition of some kind. You look at entrails, you drop arrows and see which way they point. You think the stars control your personality. We're going to debunk that. We're going to go, hey, well, your religion or whatever it is you think you have, philosophy, is nonsense as far as we're concerned. That doesn't mean you can't practice it. Go ahead and go to your church, your cathedral, wherever you go. Dance around a fire in a loincloth, take LSD, do whatever you need to do. But it doesn't concern us here in science. Does reality? Yes, of course it does. But it's at the edge. It's not susceptible to direct... you can't really measure consciousness. Well, of course it's been tried. And there might be some who would disagree, oh no, we have measurements about. But what is consciousness? Here is what I would like to propose and end this in under 10 minutes, because I'm producing this on my cell phone. Reality and consciousness can best be defined together. And when you do so, it fulfills a paradigm which I would say I'm a partial discoverer. It's sometimes difficult to say if someone discovered something, especially when it's yourself. Because we discover things for ourselves all the time. But did you discover something that nobody else has ever discovered? Then you would be the discoverer of that if it can be proved. So what I'm trying to introduce here is a technique that I've found extraordinarily valuable. Perhaps even profound, but then that would be subjective. So I'm just going to show you how to solve a paradox. A paradox is a specific kind of puzzle, in which category are riddles, all kinds of games, even sports are involved, things that have to do with gamesmanship. But in this case, what we're trying to do is something quite rational, and rationality should be at least given a quick definition here. It's when you relate two things, and so you're looking actually for structure. And one of those structures is equality. If two things are equivalent, that's a very powerful relationship. It may not be identity. Identity is more of a mathematical concept, but a relationship of equivalence, usually a quantity. But in this case, consciousness, what can we say about it? Well, one thing you would want to say right away is how are you defining it? Because it seems trivial, almost cliche, but it's a rudimentary, you absolutely have to follow this, or you can't do science in its correct way. You have to define your terms. You have to know what words mean. And it's a little bit tedious, because in science you have to be able to prove everything you say. Well, if you're trying to define something, you always encounter a recursion, at least with words. Because if you're using words to describe a word, such as consciousness or reality, you have to use words to describe it. Well, obviously that's an infinite regression, sometimes called a recursion, which is a repetitive step. It's kind of a continuing, it's a mini circular argument. You keep doing the same thing over and over again. You're regressing in this case, trying to get words that ultimately you can prove that your basis words will not have the same kind of definition as anything to follow. You're going to have to make up some words that essentially have no definition, except something utterly abstract. Without going into detail on that, the only reason I do mention that is to tell you that what we're attempting to do involves a necessary recursion, which can only be solved with a recursion break. You have to decide, for instance, in Euclidean geometry, Euclid had to begin somewhere. Well, in order to decide where to begin, what he wanted to begin with was a line. But he realized by a simple process of regression that in order for him to define the line the way he wanted, he would have to define the point first. And then you could ask, if you're, obstinate or a scientist, What do you base your definition of a point on? Nothing at all. It's retroactive. You can prove later what a point is. A point actually has no existence. In terms of building a line, it's a non-existent thing. It's null. It has no dimension, as Euclid actually stated in Greek grammar. He said it has no length, height, or breadth. Well, those are the three linear dimensions for spatial perceptual space. So those three dimensions are absent in a point. Well, that means it's not there. But later on, you can say that what it is, it's an abstraction, it's a position in a space. So that's what a point ends up being, but that's not how he defined it. Now, I've gone into that in such great detail. The reason why that's significant here is because it shows you it's difficult to get an axiomatic basis. And ultimately, you're forced in getting an axiomatic basis to have some word that won't have a definition. In some way, it's missing what all other words to follow will have, which is a definition based on words. But these words at the foundational level have no definition until later. And that's not absolute, it's superpositional. So this is actually part of the logic of the universe that we're starting to learn now as of the 20th century. Now, in the case of an approach to such an abstract, or really, it's a phenomenological, but a strange phenomenological perspective we're taking when we endeavor to even say consciousness. We all know that there is such a thing, but to define what consciousness is takes some skill and art. Now, that's a hottest issue in science right now, is what is consciousness, which I believe is perfectly legitimate, and it's not like anybody asked me, but one does have to make up one's own mind where science ends and philosophy begins. In this case, you're at the edge. Consciousness has always been a topic in science. That is, among men talking, communicating. What is consciousness? It was a very natural question. Very interesting to approach. How would you even define that? Well, I'll show you. It's not a trick. It's something that's learned empirically, at least in my empirically means you learn it. There's no other way to learn it. Or in this case, the way that you learn it is by experience. You didn't read it. You didn't figure it out in your head. You learned by doing. And it's a hit or miss. There's no guarantee that your empirical approach is going to yield you what you want, which is an efficient approach. Now, in the case of approach to consciousness, it's paradoxical. And without going into detail on what I mean by that, I think you understand in general that it's a difficult concept to corral, to define. When that happens and you can show that it's a paradox, in other words, you're facing something of a contradiction, what might that be in the case of consciousness? You're it. That implies a contradiction. Because you're trying to define something in the universe, but you're it. And this even goes to some, not brand new, but interesting related ideas, which is that what are you if you're part of everything there is? Well, I think you've encountered this line of reasoning. So it does get spooky pretty quickly if you let it. But in the case of a paradox, the secret that I want to give you is look for another paradox that's related. Try to invert the paradox. And you'll find, I've found every time, that you're going to find that there is a conjugal paradox. And if you can relate your two paradoxes together, they will tend, or actually will, define each other much better than you could define either one without the other. A good example from physics is electroforce, because there's no such thing as electroforce without magnetoforce. That's called electromagnetism, or EM, the definition of light and the definition of electromagnetism, which has more than one manifestation besides light, which namely is electroforce, which we utilize as electricity, and magnetoforce, which also has uses. But they always occur together. It's the same thing with other conjugal paradoxes. The electron and proton really manifest this symmetry between paradoxes, a conjugal symmetry, which I discovered at least the term. Conjugal symmetry is not polaric symmetry. It's a right angle symmetry in some situations. But it's more generalizable to a conjugal relationship is something that's not plus and minus, or it's not binary. It's instead of this, you have this, which is a right angle. And that constitutes a form of logic. Conjugality is orthogonality. That's the mathematical and geometric way of expressing that relationship. It's not this, plus and minus. It's this, which is a right angle. So that's the general notion of conjugality. The conjugality of paradoxes obviously transcends the physical into something more abstract and therefore not rigorously defined. So I'm using the term conjugality in a looser sense to impart the notion that it's not typical logic. You're looking for a relationship that's actually difficult to discover. And the way I express that difficulty is that it's not plus minus. It's something in between, which is conjugal. All right, so in the case of reality, what I've discovered, just to give you the solution first, reality is what you define in terms of your consciousness. So that actually retroactively defines what consciousness is. It's the system or manifestation or phenomenon. You can just say phenomenon. Consciousness is the phenomenon that senses reality. Sense here would be quite abstract. But it's your means of reading reality is your consciousness. That's what consciousness is. It's what reads reality for a human. Reality, thereby, is defined in terms of consciousness. It's what your consciousness observes. That can be a lot, by the way, including fantasies. So consciousness involves dreams, reveries, trances, hallucinations, are all part of consciousness. So consciousness is somewhat malleable. It's somewhat ductile in terms of defining it. It's obviously more than one thing. It's a system of systems. So it's consummate in some way. In other words, it has a focus. And this is the right way to geometricize what we're trying to talk about. So we have some visual impression of what we're talking about, which in the case of consciousness can only be a point. You must conceive, I say must, because this is a proof sequence. You want to define consciousness, it's a point. Here's the reason why. It's because what consciousness does, or what it is, in the sense of its functionality, is in a space. And it's the space of consciousness. But obviously, the space of consciousness extends to something that is not consciousness. That's reality. That's what reality is. But the geometric relationship is conjugal, because the consciousness has a focus. Reality defocuses. Reality is spherical all around your point. You have a point consciousness and spherical embedding space. So that's 15 minutes. Actually, that's now 20 minutes. A little longer than I wanted to run. But I hope you learned something from this rigorous approach to a very abstract question, in this case too. So I gave you the summation of my own discovery sequence, which is inductive. This is not something common. Although it actually is common, but there's hardly an art to it. Fritz Zwicky, one of my teachers, developed an art called morphology, whereby he was able to devise a methodological approach to abstract questions such as, how can I best build an aeroflight engine? And Zwicky actually addressed this question. It resulted in the turbojet. You have rocketry, you could use rockets. You could use propellers. But what was determined using the Zwicky morphological approach, using a grid, a multidimensional grid of your necessities and your resources. If you do that rigorously, you can actually force a solution to something that you could not solve, which is, in this case, what's the best means of propulsion for an aeroflight vehicle? In other words, what can I use to power a plane? And this led to actually, he has some patents. He was directly involved in the invention of the turbojet engine, which is still in use. A most interesting machine is the turbojet. So it does have practical value to be able to use induction. His method is it's an objectified form of induction. What we're doing is more free form. When you're talking about reality, that's obviously immensely abstract because it's everything other than your consciousness. If you define it that way, well, that perfectly defines what consciousness is. It's everything. Your consciousness is a point that's unique to you. It's somewhere in here. You can think right behind your eyes is a point of consciousness where everything is focalized. It's easiest to visualize it. That is, base it on your visual perception. But it's also true of hearing. It's also true for kinesthesia, your sense of balance. It's true for not so much olfactory or gustatory, but our senses that pick up the signals from the universe, such as our eyes and ears. Those sensations have to be coordinated. Well, they're coordinated at a point. Whether or not it can be proved to be a physiological point is another question. This is an abstraction that leads to a geometric insight of tremendous value and efficiency, because now you can define reality. It's what's outside that point. Well, that's everything else. And now you have a perfect definition of consciousness and a perfect definition of reality as one thing. And several deep thinkers have gone further than I have stated so far, but I think you see what is suggested. If they're so closely related, are they actually the same thing? Can we say that a human consciousness is part of reality? Well, you certainly could say so, but good luck proving it. People are trying to do that right now. Blunderingly, we're struggling. We're trying to understand something that's hard to understand. Well, that's what science does. We try to figure things out. We want to know, we want to talk about consciousness. We want to talk about reality. But in science, you have to be talking about the same thing. This comes up in almost every, I'll just say, hazy area where there may be a confrontation between points of view. Oh, this has occurred throughout the history of science and the history of humanity, where religious ideas may conflict with what are thought to be scientific ideas that disprove the religious idea. That can be quite tricky in the case of origins, and that's what we have been talking about. We've gone to Antarctica, we've gone to the Himalaya, and where we're going to go next, I may get just a little emotional. We're going to go to the Colorado Plateau, and we're going to see some wonders that more fully describe the cataclysm that took place on Earth 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, the Earth was struck by an asteroid. That is known. except for the dating. And the dating is what's controversial. Because uniformitarianism, as applied in geology, where we first got the idea of millions of years, was from a geologist named Lyell. And then it was quickly extended by Wallace and Darwin to millions of years, also describes the slow evolution of life. The slow evolution of the geology, the very slow evolution of geography, where are the continents now, the very slow evolution of life, which slowly speciated millions, actually hundreds of millions of years, that whole theory has been 100% disproved. And it has been 100% disproved for over 70 years. So there's something rotten in Denmark now, because what science should be talking about exclusively is the tremendous, furious argument over the origin of man. The origin of man is synchronized with the origin of the ecology, with which man has no relationship to the ecology, except we're cellular creatures. But we don't speciate, and we did not speciate to become human. So speciation does not apply to humans. That is known. That is a fact. How come you don't know it? How come you don't know what I just said? Can you trust that? You're going to have to. That's part of science. Thank you very much for tuning in. I will have full internet connectivity, so I won't have to use my cell phone in about 10 days if everything goes well. So thank you for tuning in. Keep looking up. There's a new moon approaching. It's the best time to do astronomy. The best action you can perform on the face of this earth is to look at the night sky. That's where you get direct teaching.